This is Dennis Wilenchik, and this is Legalese, brought to you every Wednesday from 4 to 5, preceding the Lou Dobbs Show. And this week we have on the air with us Jeff Flake. Jeff is presently serving his 6th term in Congress and represents the 6th Congressional District of Arizona as well, which includes parts of Mesa, Chandler, and all of Gilbert, Queen Creek, and Apache Junction. Jeff serves in the House Committee on Appropriation and is a 5th-generation Arizonian, raised on a ranch in Snowflake, which, as I understand it, was named after a great-great-grandfather. And after serving as a Mormon missionary in Southern Africa, he graduated from Brigham Young University, where he received a BA in International Relations and an MA in Political Science. And that's where he apparently met his wife. And in '87, Jeff started his career at a public affairs firm in Washington, D.C., and then moved back to Southern Africa, to Namibia, and was the executive director of the Foundation for Democracy, monitoring Namibia's independence process, where he saw the nation usher in freedom and democracy, which we'll be talking about. And in '92, Jeff and his family moved back to Arizona, where he became executive director of the Goldwater Institute. And in that role, Jeff worked to promote a conservative philosophy of less government, more freedom, and individual responsibility. Jeff and his wife have been married for 25 years and live in Mesa and have 5 children. Jeff, it's a pleasure to have you on the show. Welcome.
Hey, thanks for having me on, Dennis.
Absolutely. And obviously you're a congressman, which we just told our audience, but you are running now for the U.S. Senate. Why?
Well, we've had great representation over the past 3 Senate terms by John Kyle, and we've got to make sure that this seat stays Republican. John Kyle's brought a conservative philosophy to the Senate, and he's also kind of been the go-to guy on Arizona issues, particularly Arizona. 87% publicly owned. We have issues that other states just don't have, particularly in the rural areas. Water issues, resource issues, public lands issues, and he's developed quite a record on those issues. And we've got to ensure, like I said, that it stays Republican and conservative. And right now, it's jobs, the economy, debt and deficit, fiscal issues that I've had a pretty strong record, I believe, in the House, and need to bring that to the Senate.
Well, obviously, we have some serious problems out there every day. All of us as citizens are reminded of it when we just walk around in society and see what's going on, or just drive down the street and see all the people walking around aimlessly. Jeff, what can you do as U.S. Senator to do something positive that you can't do as Congressman?
Well, one of 435. It's a little tough to impact the direction of legislation. I've worked pretty hard on the issue of not just the level of spending that we do, but the type of spending. I was aghast when I got to Congress a decade ago at the process of earmarking, for example, which is just basically one member saying, I want this amount of money for my district for this project, and or for this company in my district, or for this institution. And it was a corrupting practice. And unfortunately, Republicans had really heightened the process of earmarking more than Democrats had. And that shouldn't be us. That's not what our party is.
What bills did you introduce to curb this pork barrel spending?
Well, what I did is I went to my own caucus week after week after week for a couple of years saying, we got to stop this. It's going to, we're going to have members in jail. We ended up having members in jail. And it's just ruining our brand as conservatives. When my caucus wouldn't move, I went to the House floor and started offering amendments to strike individual earmarks. And over the period of about 4 years, I offered several hundred amendments in what became known as the Flake Hour, after every appropriation bill was on the floor, because my own leadership couldn't stop me from doing it, because I was challenging their earmarks. I challenged my own speaker's earmark at one point. My own party got kind of tired of it, and in 2006, when we lost the majority, I was removed from my judiciary position post as punishment for what they call bad behavior, pointing out Republican spending. But 2 years later, we got rid of earmarks.
Yeah. And by the way, for my listeners, for the past 3 years, you've been ranked, by my research, as #1 by the National Taxpayers Union on votes for fiscal policy beneficial to taxpayers.
Yeah, I think it's actually been my first couple of years in Congress. Ron Paul beat me,
No.
and I was
Okay.
number 2 out of 535. But no, the last I think 7 or 8 years I've been number 1 or number 535, whichever way you want to rank that
Yeah, well,
as far as the spending.
Let me just ask you while we're on that, can we actually as a nation, cut or leave taxes alone and still bring down this incredible deficit and debt that this country is running amok with, and accomplish at the same time basic services that people need? Is that possible?
You bet. We're not undertaxed. We just spend too much. And I think that we can actually bring our tax rates down significantly. And the Simpson-Bowles Commission and other commissions have said the same thing. We can bring the overall rate down and bring the corporate rate, which is 35, highest in the world. If we're going to compete globally, we've got to do that. We can bring the rate down considerably if we'll get rid of a lot of the tax expenditures, the exemptions, the deductions, the loopholes that are there.
What would be the first thing you'd cut out of the federal budget that's ongoing?
Oh, probably ethanol subsidies. It's about a $5 billion item. That and other farm subsidies that distort our trade practices. That ought to be a layup. That ought to be an easy one. But there's a lot of corporate welfare out there. The left tends to exaggerate the subsidies that go to so-called big oil, but there are some subsidies that we give fossil fuel research subsidies to Chevron, for example, and there are things that we ought to get rid of there as well.
Yeah, clearly. Well, my understanding, the reason I was interrupting was, I believe that you have a bill that you've introduced, the Food and Agricultural Risk Management Bill. Is that accurate or not?
Yeah.
Yeah. Tell us about that.
Well, we have subsidies that go to agriculture in a number of different ways, depending on the commodity. For example, sugar. We subsidize sugar directly in some cases, and then we put import tariffs on the importation of sugar, and then we pay for sugar storage, for example, and then we every which way. And so this is a piece of legislation to get at a number of these subsidies. We also, for example, give you just an egregious example on cotton. We subsidize our cotton so heavily that it's put us out of sorts with our own international trade agreements. So much so that Brazil sued us in the WTO and won, and so they started to impose a tariff on all of our exports. We can't have that, and so we went to the Brazilians and said, how about we subsidize your cotton in order that we can continue to subsidize ours? And so that's what we're doing right now. We're giving Brazil $147 million a year to subsidize their own cotton.
This was during the Obama administration?
Yes, but I have to say, I mean, our farm policy and subsidies is not a Democratic problem. We Republicans passed some awful farm bills when we were in charge, and so that's more of a regional issue than it is a partisan issue. And so that as far as what to go at first, that ought to be an easy one, not just because of the waste of money. It's the distortion of our trade practices, and it makes it more difficult to trade other items as well when we're violating our trade agreements with farm produce.
Seems pretty obvious. Now, let me turn to a couple of different topics here. I noticed that about 10 years ago, you were one of just 3 members of Congress to vote against Congress's attempt to deal with corporate governance, the Sarbanes-Oxley Act, as it's become known. Is that right?
Yes.
And that law created, apparently, as it turns out, billions of dollars of compliance costs for businesses. Is that accurate?
You bet. I thought that was overreach in the extreme. We shouldn't have gone that direction. We did, and it has made us less competitive globally. We've had firms move overseas. We always wonder why do firms offshore? And it's relatively easy. You got the corporate tax rate, and then you have compliance issues with things like Sarbanes-Oxley. So, as you mentioned, I was only one of 3 votes against that. That was a tough vote because we had some shenanigans going on, and obviously needed to be addressed, but not in that fashion. And then lately we've piled on with the Dodd-Frank bill.
Well, is there any chance, if you're our next senator, that you can do something about this?
You bet. And back to your question you asked a while ago, what can you do in the Senate that you can in the House? It's tough to move legislation in the House, one individual, or to block legislation. We were able to do it with earmarks. The Senate, the rules are such that they guard the prerogative of the individual as opposed to the majority. So it's much easier for an individual if that individual is willing to stand up against their own party if they need to.
Will that be
or
one of the
whatever
things
else.
you'll do is
You bet,
deal with the
you bet.
Sarbanes-Oxley issue?
And yes, Sarbanes-Oxley, all across the board, whether it's environmental regulations, whether it's financial, healthcare, labor, those are things that in the Senate you can have a big impact on.
All right, well, we're going to come back and follow up on that, a lot of issues, but that's one of them in a few minutes after these commercial messages. We're here with Jeff Flake, who's running for Senate, US Senate. This is Dennis Wilenchik on Legalese, KFNX, News Talk Radio 1100. We'll be back in just a moment. We're back. This is Legalese, Dennis Wilenchik, every Wednesday from 4 to 5. And this week we're speaking with Jeff Flake, who is a U.S. Congressman and from Arizona and running for U.S. Senate and hopefully our next U.S. Senator. We'll get into your campaign and how that's going, Jeff, in a few minutes. But I want to come back to what we were talking about before the break. America's known, since I was a kid, and that's a long time ago, as being a leader of the world in terms of business. And it seems to me over my lifetime we've fallen down substantially, and it's kind of idiotic reasons like this Sarbanes-Oxley thing, trying to put more governance on companies that may not need it. Now there are some areas clearly that do, but unnecessary red tape, bureaucracy, that's not going to get us to where we need to go. So tell us what you're going to do when you become senator to try to change that.
Well, as I travel around and talk to people, small businesses in particular, and say, what are the hurdles you have to overcome?
Yeah.
The uncertainty on tax rates is a big one. Healthcare expenses that are going to come, particularly with Obamacare, that's another big one. But increasingly, what I'm hearing is just the overburdening of regulation.
Yeah.
I mean, they will say, and I've heard this many times, we don't know which agency is going to show up on our doorstep tomorrow
Right.
and regulate us out of business, whether it's environmental, labor, healthcare, environment, it's just
There's too
across
much.
the board. They just, it's
And therefore the
overreaching.
proliferation of lawyers, such as
You bet.
myself.
You bet. And you've seen, finally, the president recently came out and stepped up on the overreach of the EPA in just one little area. This is the tip of the iceberg.
Yeah.
But at least there's some recognition there that if you're going to get the economy going, and some people will say, well, we're coming up on an election year, is it going to be impossible to get some movement on some of these issues? It may actually make it easier, because I can tell you, if the president wasn't thinking about his reelection, he wouldn't have done what he just did in terms of telling the EPA, all right, roll back
Exactly.
on some of these regulations, because he is starting, I hope, to understand that to grow this economy, you've got to roll back some of these regulations.
I think he's
have a
starting to understand
moratorium
that he
or
may be a
whatever.
one-term president.
That's exactly it. And the motivation, every one-term president, or every first-term
Yeah.
president wants to be a second-term president.
Right.
And whatever motivates him, that's fine with me, as
Right.
long as he's doing the right thing.
All right, well, let's talk for a minute about, aside from just the corporate governance issue, what is Jeff Flake as U.S. Senator going to try to do in terms of, bringing this messed up economy back, aside from what you've already described? Is there anything else you have on the agenda?
Yeah, like I said, we need some certainty on tax policy moving ahead. I don't think anybody's realistic saying we're going to have massive tax cuts in the future to spur the economy. I'm an ardent supply sider. I think that people spend their money better than government does. So you leave it in their hands and you do better, you grow the economy, you grow the pie. Having said that, what I think all of us recognize, as we talked a little about before, is that we have a tax code that hasn't been revisited really since 1986, and it's like any home with an attic, you got to clean it out every
Why
once
does
in
it
a
have to
while.
be so complicated? I've never understood this in all the years as a lawyer.
Well, it just gets more so and more so, and then you have every special interest that got the loophole
Right.
looking to protect it.
Right.
And then you just have to pile on to give that favor elsewhere, and it just grows and grows and grows, and pretty soon, individuals can't even do their own taxes.
No.
I don't dare, I can tell
I
you
don't either.
that. And it's a tax code that has to be flattened, and you can do that in a way that lowers overall rates, but frankly will produce a lot more revenue in the end, not just the supply side effects. There are some Republicans who say every time you get rid of a subsidy or a tax expenditure in the tax code, you have to match that with a tax cut. For example, the ethanol subsidy we talked about before, that came up for a vote in the Senate, and some were saying, hey, you can't cut that tax credit out unless you match it with a tax decrease somewhere else. I don't believe that. I say if you can get rid of a bad subsidy, get rid of it. If that means extra revenue that you can pay the debt down faster, do it. And so that's an area in terms of getting the economy going. Now, some will say, you know, what are you going to do for Arizona specifically, the housing market? I can tell you, the federal government has, over the past a few years, passed a number of programs, the HAMP or others, to try to deal with individual foreclosure issues. And you could do that till the cows come home, and you aren't going to make a significant difference unless the overall economy is growing. And that's what we need to do. We need more jobs out there. Jobs are created by the private sector, not by government. I think the stimulus spending that we've seen over the past 2
But
years.
you're right, you can't bring down interest rates anymore, so that's not stimulating.
Right. I mean, when you look at there are limits to monetary policy, particularly when you're at basically zero interest rates, and then fiscal policy. Obviously, there's no more money to stimulate in that way, because when you get to 100% of debt for GDP, that's not a road you want to go down. At least most of us don't want to go down. There are some ardent Keynesians who do, but I think they're vastly outnumbered.
But I mean, the reality is, as an Arizona congressman and hopefully future senator, the reality is this state was built, as you all know, on construction, growth, home building, and that kind of thing, which then spurs all these other industries to be attractive. And of course, we do have a tax code here in the state. Some states don't even have that. We don't have some of the incentives that Texas has, for example, and other states that are growing. So I recognize that as U.S. Senator, you have just so much control over those issues, but what can you do, again, as U.S. Senator to sort of spur growth within our state in particular?
Well, one thing right now, as I mentioned before, this state, Arizona, is 87% publicly owned. It's tough to have goods and services, when you're only taxing 13% of the land. And with that, we have issues that other states don't. So one, you've got to make sure that you have water policy moving ahead. Arizona, they say whiskey's for drinking, water's for fighting, or whatever else. It's important here, the water, and to make sure that California doesn't take it all. So moving ahead, that's why you need an Arizona delegation to make sure we focus on. Two, public lands. One thing the Obama administration is trying to do right now is basically go in and abrogate the Arizona Wilderness Act that was passed by Barry Goldwater and Mo Udall and stakeholders on the right and the left, environmentalists, industry folks. Everybody came together in the 80s and passed the Arizona Wilderness Act, which set aside 1 million more acres in northern Arizona to make sure the Grand Canyon remains pristine, but it also, away from the Grand Canyon, let certain areas remain there for uranium mining, for example. Well, the Obama administration just went in and tried to remove more acreage, about 1 million more in acreage from that withholding, and so that could mean as many as 4,000 jobs go out the door that could have been here for uranium mining that is clean, that is environmentally sound, that does not impact the Grand Canyon at all. It's away from the Grand Canyon, and it's so-called Baresha pipe mining, which is 6-year life of the mine.
What can you do as a senator about that?
Well, that we're trying in the House. I actually attached language to the Interior Appropriation Bill that blocked the implementation of the President's order to do that. In the Senate, we were able to do that in the House. We still have to protect that language on the floor. But I can tell you in the Senate, it's much easier to do that because you just have more leverage in that regard. Also, we need to make sure that Arizona, that we have the best weather here for flying. We have public lands that's there for the Barry Goldwater Range can't be replicated anywhere else in the country. So our military bases here, we just need to make sure that the encroachment issues don't force the Air Force or others to move elsewhere. And as a U.S. Senator, those are the issues you deal with as well, to make sure that Arizona can compete for those defense jobs that are going to go somewhere.
And what about the construction industry in general, before a break?
Well, we have infrastructure needs here in Arizona that
yeah, we're not California.
No.
Don't confuse us.
I was going to put Arizona and California, for example, are so-called donor states. We're giving more money to Washington than we get back for our infrastructure needs, and we need to make sure that we get whatever dollar we give, we got to get back, and we should get it back in a way that doesn't, where the dollar you give to Washington doesn't spend like 60 cents once you do Davis-Bacon and everything else. In absent earmarks, if we can keep earmarks at bay, that will ensure that donor states, current donor states like Arizona, California, Florida, Texas, get their full reward. We get our dollar for dollar, because in the past, the way that the chairman of the committees have basically bribed states to take less than they give is by earmarks. And your state will be short $100 million over the next 4 years, but you can have this $30 million to spend how you want in your district. And that's what's been done for all the donor states for too long, the last 3 or 4 transportation cycles. And so in order to make sure that we can continue to build and grow, we've got to ensure that for every dollar we send to Washington, we get it back.
All right, thanks for that. We're going to take a break for a few minutes here. We're talking with Jeff Flake. This is Dennis Wilenchik on Legalese, and we'll be coming back and talking about things that affect you all, such as gas at the pump, which I just filled up today, and unfortunately it cost me a pretty penny. So we'll be back. This is Dennis Wilenchik in a few minutes. This is Dennis Wilenchik, and we're back on Legalese every Wednesday from 4 to 5 on KFNX News Talk Radio 1100. And this week we're pleased to have Jeff Flake, a candidate for U.S. Senator, currently a U.S. Congressman from Arizona, here with us. And Jeff, before the break, we were talking about some of the things that you would do as a U.S. Senator to help the situation out there in the economy. And we were discussing earmarks and some of those issues. But let's bring this down to the average listener here of our show. What are you going to do about gas at the pump? I mean, as I said before the break, you fill up, it's a $50 bill. Most people just can't do that. That was taken for granted when I was young. You bought the car, but the gas
Right.
was not considered to be a major expense. What's your position on this now?
Hey, I'm an all of the above energy policy guy. We need to drill more. We need to make it easier to access both oil and natural gas in federal lands. Part of the reason we're having the trouble with these deep water spills like we had in the Gulf last year is because we've made it so difficult to drill onshore or in the shallows. And so we've got to cut through the red tape and make the permitting process easier. We haven't permitted a nuclear plant in the last 30 years, or haven't started to build one. We finally started permitting them, but it just takes so long to do because of the cumbersome red tape. Now, we've had this wonderful discovery of these shale natural gas reserves, particularly in Pennsylvania, and now the environmentalists are trying to shut all that off.
Yeah.
The so-called fracking procedure that allows us to get that, and I mean we have literally hundreds of years worth of natural gas. We are the Saudi Arabia of natural gas,
Yeah.
and that's a cheap alternative to gasoline, and it's better for the environment, you name it.
Yeah.
But as soon as we have an abundant source of anything, it seems the left wants to go and cut it off and continue to raise prices of any of the fossil fuels so much that supposedly we're just going to jump into solar and wind and renewables tomorrow. Despite all of the subsidies that we've done in those areas, that's still less than 2% of our electricity, for example, is generated by solar and wind at this point. And I'm all for it. If the market can bear it, do more of that. But we're a long way from being able to rely on that. So for the foreseeable future, it's going to be fossil fuels, and we've got to ensure that we have access to them.
Talking with Jeff Flake, who's a candidate for U.S. Senate, currently a congressman. I'm going to turn the conversation a little bit here. You have an interesting background, I noted, in going back to Southern Africa. Tell our audience why you did that. Why did you go back to Namibia, and what lessons did you learn there?
Well, I as you mentioned, I initially was in Southern Africa as a Moorland missionary back
Right.
in '81, '82. This visit to Namibia 7 years later was not related to
Right.
any religious
That's what I'm
missionary
asking. Why did you go back? And
Namibia was gaining its independence from South Africa. I happened to learn the language of Afrikaans when I was in South Africa years before. They speak a lot of that in Namibia, so that was
a Dutch
attractive.
derivative? or
Yeah, it
something?
is.
Yeah.
And but more than that, for any political junkie like me, to be there when a country has its first elections and writes its constitution and installs its first government, that's nirvana.
Yeah.
And it was, what a fascinating time. The week that they had their elections, November of '89, was the same week the Berlin Wall came down.
Wow.
And so it was fascinating to be there when the Soviet model had just collapsed.
Sure.
And gratefully it did just in time, because the new government certainly took note of that.
Yeah.
And Namibia, they wrote a good constitution. They're doing pretty well. They have the benefit of a small population, a lot of land. It's about twice the size of California, and some big reserves, a lot of the gem quality diamonds.
What lessons did you take away from that?
You know, one that if you have good structures in place, a good constitution, and you have the right institutions there, civic institutions, both on the legal side and on the democracy side, that you don't need massive oil wealth or anything else. You can, if you have those structures in place, those institutions, you can make a go of it, and they've done well. It's not a rich country by any means, but they've done well, and I take my hat off to them and to the other countries. When I was there, it was the so-called Western Contact Group. The U.S., Britain, was in West Germany, and France, and Canada were there to ensure that they got off to a good start. And I mean, some people are down on international institutions of any kind that go in and aid countries to get a good start. And I have to say, even the UN does a lot of bad things, particularly the General Assembly. But this was a UN Security Council resolution that was implemented while I was there, UN Security Council Resolution 435, and the UN behaved themselves and comported themselves quite well.
Well, you know, while we're on that, I think I noted somewhere that you propose reform to the United Nations as one of your platforms, I guess, and easing of trade with Cuba. Is that correct?
You bet.
So tell us what reforms you'd institute at the United Nations to bring that into line with reality.
Well, I mean, like I said,
because I take my hat off to you.
There's a lot that needs to be done at the UN. Frankly, the organizations that basically spawn out from the General Assembly are of dubious value in my view. But the Security Council has at times their participation or their peacekeeping that they've done, in the Syria-Israeli border, for example, has been a good thing. Resolution 435 in Southern Africa worked. It can work. It needs some reforms. I think that our participation they probably ask too much of us. We host the United Nations with all the issues that come with that. And then we pay, about 33% of the operating costs, and almost that same amount for peacekeeping costs. That's disproportionate to our population and economic
I see. So those are the kinds
numbers.
of reforms.
So those kind of reforms. But then also, you mentioned Cuba. Cuba has always just kind of bothered me, and that goes back to my time in Africa too. The Resolution 435 was implemented only because the Cubans finally decided to get out of Angola, and they had 60,000 troops there. But in my view, the best way to deal with Cuba is, if you want to get rid of Fidel Castro and Raul, make them deal with spring break once in a while. Just right now, the sanctions that we've imposed on Cuba are really not sanctions on Cuba as much as they are on us.
Exactly.
It tells Americans that they can't go to Cuba, and that just has seemed crazy to me. Now, if we
what do you propose in that regard?
Just lift the travel ban completely. I would lift the entire economic embargo. I mean, that made sense, perhaps, the economic embargo when Cuba was a client state of the Soviet Union, when it was fomenting revolution around the world. It is not now.
Yeah, it's a whole different deal.
Yeah, and so, but in particular with the travel ban, if we lifted our travel ban completely tomorrow, the Castros would implement some restrictions of their own. They already have some, but they do more because they want the revenue without the influence. But if somebody's going to limit my travel, it should be a communist. I mean, it shouldn't be us.
Well, yeah,
and
it's
so
an archaic principle.
I've traveled down there a number of times. I can tell you the Cubans don't hate Americans. They understand that their government is, past its date, and but man, we'd all be better off if we just allowed Americans to travel there. And frankly,
It is a silly policy.
It
right?
is, it really is.
It had its day, but.
And I was able to pass legislation a couple of times to block enforcement of the travel ban. And it had identical language passed in the Senate, the Flake amendment there, and it just could never get Bush to sign it. And this is one thing that President Obama has done right. He has lifted restrictions on Cuban American travels. Cuban Americans can travel back and forth as much as they want, which is a good thing. Religious travel has been weak, the restrictions have gone, so it's a good thing that one.
All right, well, we appreciate that. We're going to come back and talk about the border and other issues with Jeff Flake, who's running for United States Senate in the state of Arizona, and this is Dennis Wilenchik on Legalese, and back after these commercial messages. This is Dennis Wilenchik on Legalese, brought to you every Wednesday from 4 to 5 on KFNX, leading into the Lou Dobbs Show. And we're here talking with Jeff Flake, who is a congressman, 6-term congressman from Arizona, and soon to be, I think, our next U.S. Senator, if we're lucky. Jeff has been talking about a lot of different issues here today with us. And Jeff, in our last segment here, before we get rolling on some more issues, I want to just ask you, I noted that you had grown up, of course, in Arizona, but I think on a ranch near Snowflake. Is that accurate?
Yeah.
And that's a little bit different. So, as you grew up, did you ever think you'd be in politics?
No, I just.
Were you
wanted
milking a cow or something?
Yeah, exactly, I was. I was just going to say that. I just wanted a job where I didn't have to milk a cow every morning. I got tired of that.
Sure.
But my dad, I watched my dad in public service. He was a mayor of Snowflake, which kind of came by rotation.
Yeah,
It was a great example of public service. But
Right.
I had a lot of uncles and aunts and others who would also involve themselves on, I mean, everything from irrigation districts, to school boards, city councils. My uncle Jake Flake from
Right.
Snowflake was Speaker of the House here.
Yeah.
And
Is he still in the...
he Jake unfortunately died about 2
I didn't
years
realize
ago
that.
after being thrown from his horse.
Oh, that's right, I do remember that now, yeah.
Which just one of the great, and as I
Freak
go around
accident.
the state, yeah, I tell you, there is more respect for that man and
Yeah.
what he stood for, and that has made life so much easier for me.
Right.
Because a lot of people mix us up too, and
Yeah.
I've benefited immensely.
I'm glad you mentioned that.
From the good example that people like my dad and my uncle Jake and others have set.
Yeah.
But
So that's what got you interested. And
it
who were
did,
your
and-
heroes as you grew up?
Well, Barry Goldwater was
Yeah.
one. I mean, he was Mr. Arizona. I mean, he just.
My son has a big poster of Barry Goldwater in his office.
Just kind of the iconoclastic, outdoorsman and.
But
and
an
libertarian
individualist, the right
leaning-
individualist.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And that just I always thought a lot of him as I.
Spoke his mind.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. As I got into my senior year in high school, Reagan was elected, and
Mm.
I was always a big fan of his. Margaret Thatcher, I just always admired her throughout the '80s, and was able to meet her later as she came for the Goldwater Institute
Really?
thing. And then,
She very pleasant or?
oh, it was just an incredible experience to have her there. And then
Yeah.
people like William F. Buckley Jr. I was able to
Yeah.
go sailing with him
Yeah.
at least one time, and it was
I
just.
think he wrote books on sailing.
Yeah, he did a few, and
Yeah.
I like those. But and then people like people may not expect, but when I was in Southern Africa in the early '80s, there was this terrorist in jail named Nelson Mandela, and he could
Yeah.
never get out because what he would, the havoc he would wreak upon this
Yes.
country and region. And he got out, and in my view, was an incredible president.
Yeah,
And,
marvelous example of someone to try to bring people
you
together,
know,
and
yeah,
you wouldn't expect it listening to
unbelievable.
the
And,
publicity.
I just, I think the world of that man, and so do most people in Southern Africa
Yeah.
who are just completely surprised at the level of forgiveness he had,
Yeah.
for example.
Amazing.
Just an amazing guy.
All right, well, that's interesting. And anybody outside of politics that you wanted to emulate, or you always wanted to be in politics? Sounds like.
Oh no, I was a sports figure. If I could be, if I could be playing professional football or basketball or baseball, I'd probably do that in a heartbeat.
Okay, so this is a second calling. All right.
But no, there are a lot of people I admire in those fields as well.
Yeah. What do you think of President Obama?
I as an individual, I like the man. I played basketball with President Obama on the South Lawn.
Oh.
And I get along
It'd be
with
hard
him.
to dribble on a lawn, but
He has a nice court. It
Yeah.
used to be the tennis court.
I bet
It's
he
been
does.
transformed. But I enjoy association with him. He's invited me on Air Force One, and I like being around him. but I don't think that he's been a good president at all.
Yeah.
I think that he.
Well, certainly the
just-
change that he predicted hasn't happened, except for the worse.
Yeah, for the worse. I
Yeah.
mean, I just don't think that he's cut out for this job.
Yeah.
He certainly hasn't.
Great
shown-
speaker, but
Right, but seems to be completely in over his head.
yeah. Now, you're a strong supporter of the military, like Senator McCain. Is that right?
You bet.
What do you think about this movement that's going on in the Arab world? Is that going to continue?
You know, I hope so. I hope it continues through 2 more countries right now.
Yeah, I
in
know.
particular, Syria. If it can continue in Syria, like it looks like it's doing, I can tell you there are going to be some idling aircraft on
Yeah.
runways in Tehran
Yeah.
because they've got to be worried
Right.
at what's coming there, so I hope it continues there.
What about what's going on in Libya right now? Any thoughts on that?
You know, I hope that the future, gives the people of Libya, better than they've had in the past.
Yeah.
And that the country
Seems like
is-
we've seen this before, haven't we, with Iraq, with some leader that was on the run,
Yeah.
found in a little hole somewhere.
Yeah, there was some cartoon a while ago
Yeah.
that had him in the same spider hole that,
Yeah. He
Saddam
rents
was
out the
in.
same spider hole.
Yeah.
Yeah, I wonder what that goes for. But anyway, let's talk quickly about the Department of Homeland Security, because you voted against the formation of the department. Did you make the right decision?
I did.
Why?
That's one of the votes I'm most proud of. When we saw it, they said at the time that we're going to make this streamlined, these agencies that were going to basically go away because the Department of Homeland Security was going to
Yeah.
be there. It wasn't going to cost any more money
That was
because
the
they were
idea.
simply going to consolidate. We did none of that. It was $30 billion or so to start
Just
with.
another
It was
typical
just
federal program there.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And some of these agencies still don't talk to each other, and it's just an added layer. And when you look at, say no more than the TSA, and the way that DHS has handled the TSA at airports, and everybody goes through that and sees it, and I don't think anybody feels much safer than they
You know,
did
it's so
before.
ridiculous. I was just
Boy,
talking
talk
about somebody.
hassle.
I was just talking about this morning. If you fly in a private plane, you get on the plane, nobody checks you for anything. You can go
Right.
off and do whatever you want to do. And yet you go to the airport, you see a 90-year-old woman who's being manhandled and muscled and searched. It's ridiculous.
I tell you, that when I go to the airport, and I go to the airport a lot,
Yeah.
and just despite what some people think, members of Congress go through the same lines, and do we have no special favors or anything there?
Better healthcare system,
But,
we'll come to that.
but I can tell you, there's nothing that makes my blood boil. Than seeing that. I mean, the grandmothers and little
It's
kids
idiotic.
being searched, and just the utter ineptitude of this whole system. And I hope that as I get to the Senate with a little more leverage than I
Yeah,
have
yeah.
now,
Well, we hope so.
we can change that.
Let's talk quickly about the border issues. What's your position on SB 1070 and the whole mess that's going on? I mean, real quickly, I had a conversation with somebody today who was Hispanic in a meeting earlier this morning. He's an activist, and I said, I don't get it. You have to be here legally, don't you? And they said, the real issue is we're against these profiling, like sweeps and so forth. That's what the real issue is. What do you think the real issue here is?
Well, the real issue is securing the border. And the icing is today we have an example of what a secure border looks like. And it was always in the past of, let's have a secure border. Well, what does that mean? What does operational control of the border mean? Well, in 80 miles of the 300 and some mile border we have in Arizona, 80 miles of it is the so-called Yuma sector. In the Yuma sector, we have operational control, meaning that the sheriffs, everybody concedes that if an illegal alien crosses, we have a reasonable expectation of catching it.
Right.
In the Tucson sector, we have nothing approaching that, and for every illegal we apprehend, the Department of Homeland Security estimates that 2 get by. And it's probably more than that.
What's the answer to this problem?
Well, the answer is a combination of what we did in the Tucson sector. And Judge Roll, who was unfortunately killed in the Gifford shooting, played a big part in that. And Senators Kyle and McCain worked hard at it to make sure that those who cross illegally are caught and there are consequences. That's the biggest part of what we don't have in the Tucson sector. You still have almost a catch and release policy there. In the Yuma sector, what we did is had a sure consequences program that was rolled out mile by mile across that 80 miles until those who were crossing knew that if they crossed, if it was a second time caught, you know, they were in for at least a week.
What
maybe
about the
more than
illegals that are here now? What would you do with them?
You know, that's a complicated issue that you just got to say, let's secure the border first and then deal with that issue. But I can tell you, rounding up illegals has never been the problem here. We have a lot of programs you can do with that. SB 1070 has perhaps made that easier, but the problem is, what do you do when you get them here? There's due process that they're accorded. And
It's a complicated issue.
It is a complicated issue, but I can tell you, let's just secure that border.
Well, we put a man on the moon, but we can't seem to secure the border for some reason, so. What's your position on a fence?
I'm sorry, on the fence?
Yeah.
Hey, build it where it makes sense, and where it doesn't,
Right.
do aviation and everything else.
We've got just a brief period of time, but very quickly, if you can summarize your position on the healthcare system that's broken. What would you do with that?
Give a couple of things quickly. Give individuals the same benefits that companies currently have in terms of being able to purchase healthcare premiums with pre-tax dollars.
So you get rid of the Obamacare, I take it?
Oh, you bet.
Yeah.
I thought that
And you're
was
big,
what I was
yeah,
saying.
that's what I was saying.
Yes,
But
get
you-
rid of Obamacare and then do some free market reforms that will reduce cost and reduce costs and better quality, and force insurance companies to compete across state lines. They don't right now, and it would lower costs if they did. There are a number of things we can do short of single payer system or whatever else. In fact, going the other direction than that, and that we ought to do, because I can tell you, Obamacare we cannot afford. Aside from all the other problems of individual rights and everything else, we just can't afford it.
All right. Well, thank you. It's been a pleasure having you here. We've been talking for the hour with hopefully Senator Jeff Flake, presently Congressman, who's running for U.S. Senate, and I hope that you'll give Jeff all your consideration when it comes time, and we'll try to follow you, Jeff, and hopefully when you get down the road, maybe you can appear again if you have some time. We really are pleased that you were able to be here today.
I'd love to. Thank you, Dennis.
Thank you. And this is Dennis Wilenchik, KFNX News Talk Radio, and we will talk next week.